Hello, and welcome to my audio blog, an archive documenting the trials and tribulations that came along with putting on an immersive production of the Grimm Tales at the De Montfort University in Leicester. My key focus areas for today's blog are going to be aimed at working with an audience through the means of immersive theatre, designing the world of the play, and then going over the overall rehearsal progress and how myself and my group navigated our way through working together as both an ensemble and as collaborators. But before we begin, be sure to make sure you've had the opportunity to fully acquaint yourself with our segment of the performance in the video here. If you haven't already, simply pause this recording and have a watch via the link in the presentation. Now, without further ado, let's begin. When facilitating an immersive and interactive performance, the first problem most practitioners run into is controlling audience participation and placement. In Jason Warren's Creative Worlds, How to Make Immersive Theatre, there are many examples of unpredictable audience participants, specifically regarding placement, in which audience members end up standing around the edges of the space that the shows are being hosted in. In order to combat said issue, Jason Warren advises to use a few easy devices in order to bring an audience into the correct positioning and keep up their focus, and all without having to break immersion and literally telling them where to stand. The first device Jason recommended was lighting. Lighting can be an integral part of keeping an audience's attention, as well as facilitating a location of which to surround and stand in. Warren specifically found, after conducting a small test, that people generally seem to gravitate towards natural light, and that they will stand around the edges of a lit area rather than within the light itself. Specifically, in Hansel and Gretel, the tale in which I had the most involvement, we wanted our audience to form two half circles that would form to represent the forest that Hansel and Gretel would travel through and around. We used lighting during the pre-show segment that filled the space that we as performers would be using, and made sure to make the lighting imitate daylight seeping through a forest canopy. We also made sure to have our witch's house and the family home that we start at lit up as well, in order to signify and convey to our audience members that these spaces would also need to be used throughout the performance. This also split the performance locations up into zones naturally. Warren states that, quote, "a zone is an area of space that shares a boundary," end quote. Although, in most cases you would assume this boundary would be formed in the physical and literal sense of the word, Warren also says to, quote, "bear in mind that the boundaries may not be totally solid. A row of narrowly spaced chairs would define a zone just as clearly as a wall," end quote. When reading into this, myself and my group almost had a sort of eureka moment, as we had been struggling to work out how to keep the audience confined to the semicircle shape that we had originally envisioned for quite some time. So we then decided to solve the issue by adding some chairs at each end of the semicircle. Audience members could now naturally be inclined to stay within a controlled space, and we had also solved the issue of enabling access to those who aren't as strong on their feet nowadays to the performance. However, when it came to direct audience interaction, there was still a lot of ironing out to do. In our performance, we had planned on incorporating audience participation from the very beginning. Originally, this was only going to be achieved through giving members of the audience the pebbles and bread that Hansel was leaving behind in order to find his way home. But, as the performance developed and evolved, we found that every character could find a way of interacting with the audience directly. For myself as the woodcutter, this was through the form of comic relief, providing the odd reaction or scream while forming direct eye contact with a random member of the audience for a more intimate moment. For the witch, a similar tactic was used, but instead of comic relief, the witch instilled fear into her unfortunate audience members. We found that these direct acknowledgements of the audience were integral to forming a connection via which they could really take in the narrative, and we could invoke emotional responses, whether that be laughter, concern, or fear. As well as things were going, though, during the devising process, it was also worth considering the issues and obstacles that can come up when using audience participation in a performance. In Gareth White's Audience Participation in Theatre, Aesthetics of the Invitation, it says, quote, "We cannot understand interactive performance without considering the provenance of these actions and interactions, how invitations to participate are made, and how people are able to respond to these interactions." End quote. After Googling what provenance meant, it was then clear to us that understanding how reciprocated responses formed was the key to attempting to form a prediction or a predicted response of an audience member and stray away from unpredictability. It's actually quite ironic looking back at this now, as during our performance we had underestimated our audience and their eagerness to interact. After spending months trying to make sure we had as many potential scenarios prepared for, we had found ourselves in a bit of a predicament. During the scene in which Hansel and Gretel are trying to find the bread that was supposed to have gone missing, our audience members actually held out the pieces of bread in their faces in an attempt to help them get home. Due to this action potentially throwing off the entirety of the performance, the only thing Ollie and Cornelia could do in that moment was simply to pretend that the bread wasn't there, which could have potentially broken the entire immersion of the audience. If we'd have had some extra time to think about this, I believe we could have turned this into a comedic moment in which Hansel and Gretel look shocked and then immediately cover their eyes with their hands in order to not see the bread, which would have hopefully brought some laughter and further engagement with the performance. Also, provenance means an origin of beginning, if anyone was wondering. Overall, I found that audience engagement and interaction was really good during the performance, and other than that one snag, things went rather smoothly, and people were actually really excited to be involved. And now we move on to designing the world of the play. After we had worked out how to include audience participation, we then came to the point of designing the world that our performance was going to take place in. We knew that we wanted to immerse our audience and create something that felt fantastical, but didn't pull away from the audience's suspense of disbelief. I had read in Josephine McConn's Immersive Theatres, Intimacy and Immediacy in Contemporary Performance that, quote, "A great deal of immersive theatre, whether one-to-one or large-scale, taps into the total installation aesthetic, where the scenographic experience offered not only physically immerses the viewer in three-dimensional space, it is psychologically absorptive too." End quote. And this idea of total installation aesthetic really sat with me and made me want to utilise the entirety of the space that we had available. This meant that we could create something less traditional in terms of how the audience physically views the performance, as it isn't taking place on a stage, but rather around them, and also made sure to add to the overall immersion. Ultimately, it helped us to decide on the general layout that we went with, of which you can see on your screen on the right-hand side. But in order to take this further, we also decided to use Eleanor Fuchs's Visit to a Small Planet text. When discussing this onwards, I will be referring to the author as Eleanor simply due to the fact that I struggle with the pronunciation of her last name. Luckily, I had had prior interaction with Eleanor's text already, having read it just a year prior, which was extremely helpful due to this being quite an elaborate and complex text to deal with. Ultimately, Eleanor tackles the task of creating a truly detailed and immersive world that sets itself a set of rules and boundaries to increase its believability. The text asks you to think about things such as the outward appearance of the world, the people that live within it, their socio-economic place in society, as well as the weather, seasons, and changes that are happening not just inside your main story, but also around the world itself. Eleanor asks you to envision a planet that this story is taking place on in order to fulfill and realise the story's aesthetic and believability on stage. As a group, we decided to tackle just some of the questions that Eleanor brings to light, one by one. We started with clothing and decided that what we could decipher from the text was that due to the poverty and food scarcity that had struck the land, our characters wouldn't be dressed in the finest clothes, but rather the baggy t-shirts, dirty aprons and patchy jackets that you can see in the images. Next was the weather and time. We knew that the performance as a whole would take place over 4 weeks, but only covered the first 3 days in full. As a result, we knew we wanted to replicate a day and night cycle to convey the passing of time. This ended up being shown via the lighting and sound that I myself was responsible for. In order to create these day and night ambiences, I used a combination of lighting and audio states. In terms of lighting, I replaced our naturalistic lighting that we used during daytime segments and replaced it with a moonlight blue on areas of interest that went into a deeper, darker blue everywhere else around the scene in order to create focus. In terms of audio, I spliced together various free-to-use sounds as well as pre-recorded ones in my own time in order to create soundscapes for both day and night time. You can listen to these soundscapes by clicking on the audio buttons attached into this slide to hear the difference for yourself. And I've also attached some other sound bites from the performance so that you can get a better idea of how layering sounds and effects can impact tone and atmosphere throughout our performance. We also looked at other things like who else lived in the world and how they were relevant to our specific narrative. We ended up assuming that every tale within the Grimm Tales had a link, and therefore created one big world. For example, in Little Red Riding Hood, the woodcutter who saves Red Riding Hood was going to be me, the woodcutter in Hansel and Gretel. In order to convey this, we used characters from the tales that we hadn't used in our performance as sort of transport characters that escorted audiences from one tale to another. Little Red Riding Hood would specifically talk to her audience members about the day the woodcutter they're about to see saved her life. If it wasn't for Eleanor's text, I doubt we'd have thought to incorporate this detail that ultimately created a deeper connection between our tales and expanded the world in which the play took place. So, we had our audience participation sorted, our set fully planned and ready to be realised, and now all we had to do was get on with the rehearsal process, arguably one of the most tedious tasks in the entirety of bringing our performance to life. Along with repetitive line running and performing, we had to come to terms with hearing critical feedback regarding our performance, not just from our class peers and professor, but also each other. In order to navigate this tricky terrain and avoid any potential conflict, we agreed to make sure that while being critical, we would also be constructive with the feedback we gave and make sure to find positives in each rendition of our ever-evolving performance. We also knew that any feedback from the rest of our class and our professor was purely unbiased and in the best interest of our overall performance. As such, it was very rare that we came across any disputes, and more often than not, this agreement actually led to many very important additions to the performance. For example, we added more movement to the stepmother and the woodcutter, which allowed them to not get lost and forgotten by the audience as they were originally, due to the fact that they were sat down most of the time. And we also made some changes regarding the use of shadow play within our performance. Rather than having the entire family behind the shadow screen like we had originally planned during scenes in the house, we only had the woodcutter and his wife in there, which allowed the audience to see things more from Hansel and Gretel's perspective while they were listening in, and it also made it clearer that they slept in separate rooms, which surprisingly was not so blatant beforehand. While this was all very good, there were also some issues and obstacles that we had to face as a group. One of the biggest issues we found was that keeping energy levels up was kind of hard when you were rehearsing twice a week for 3 hours at a time, especially when you'd had a 3 hour class just prior. To combat this, Ollie came up with the idea to play a game at the start of each session called Psychiatrist. The game got our brains going, as each round one person would leave the room and the group would decide on a rule that person would need to figure out. One time we had to roll up our sleeves every time Morgan said "lay there," exactly like that. The game got us bonding and also got us ready to play with our work and try things that we wouldn't normally have had the energy and focus to do. We would also incorporate a short 15-minute break halfway into our rehearsals in order to make sure we wouldn't burn out and lose focus. Although I felt that keeping energy and morale up was integral to making sure we kept working on this piece, I also feel as though sometimes we could get a little bit too sidetracked and take a few breaks that were probably longer than they should have been. Perhaps if we had utilised our time more, then we would have come up with more ideas that could have really evolved the performance into something even more. But overall, I think my takeaway from this experience is that rehearsing can be fun, and that if you lose that fun and enjoyment, then you're probably doing it wrong. And now it is time to evaluate my final performance and contributions. I think in terms of accomplishments, I'm most proud of my involvement with the audio and tech within the show. I've dabbled with sound and lighting before, but never to the extent of being involved with the form in an entire production. Doing the sound for all of the groups and editing things was really challenging, but also immensely validating once accomplished. I also feel that these additions to the tales greatly improved the overall experience of the show, and, due to the sound being sorted by myself alone, it added a lot of continuity when it came to the tones of each tale. It also added some small obstacles. When it came to tech runs, it turned out I had to find a way to change the file types due to a conflict on the computers. But once I'd figured that out, I'd learnt a valuable life lesson regarding being prepared for anything on the spot. I think as a cast and as collaborators, we as a cast also accomplished what we had set out to do in terms of creating an immersive and engaging performance centred around the Grimm Tales. I've also received plenty of feedback from audience members who say they had a truly enjoyable experience and had learnt about some new tales that they hadn't heard of before. If we'd had longer to put together this show, then I'd imagine it would be 1,000,000 times better and more elaborate. But that can be said for any production, and I think we utilised the time we had to a practical extent. Overall, the production was an absolute success, and I feel as though I was a part of that success, just as much as the rest of our amazing and hard-working cast. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my blog. I'll leave you with the bibliography now.